The views and opinions expressed in this broadcast do not necessarily reflect or represent the views and opinions of WBGR Network. Any questions or concerns about what is said should be directed to the show host, whose information will be provided upon request.
Soto at first after the homer by Rendon. Kendrick into the opposite corner. That one well hit. Springer looks up, and it's gone! Howie Kendrick has delivered the Nationals a one-run lead!
Hello, this is Felix Bass, and you're watching the Washington Sports Den on WBGR Network. And this is another one of those special episodes. It's one of those episodes that are not like the others. One of those episodes in which I take another polarizing argument. Once I've used the argument with whether or not fighting should be allowed in hockey, then another time I had an argument between LeBron James and Michael Jordan. That is, I had an episode that was predicated upon the argument that argues between which one of the two men were the best basketball player in NBA history. Now, in this episode, I'm possibly going to ask the most polarizing question yet, the most polarizing sports-related question I have ever asked on this show. Who is the greatest NFL team of all time? Now, it'll depend on who you talk to. It'll depend on your source. It'll depend on the reasoning that you use. And the fact of the matter is, quite frankly, you're going to get different answers, and none of them are going to be definitive. There are too many factors at play. Every NFL team has a 53-man roster, and of course, you have to take into consideration different eras of the NFL played by different rules. You had different dynamics. You had different nuances that impacted the game in those eras. So when you put all that into play, once again, you can't really make a definitive argument. But I will say this. If you are to make a definitive claim, you're going to have a definitive conclusion, and there has to be a single answer. You're not only going to need stats, but you're going to need to show the significance of said statistics. For example, a person could say that the greatest NFL team of all time was the Miami Dolphins of 1972. Well, in fact, you can argue that it was the greatest season in terms of win-loss percentages. They had a 100% winning percentage. They only played 14 games in a regular season back then. That's another factor that would nuance it somewhat, shorter seasons. And of course, you had fewer teams in the NFL then. Of course, in those days, you didn't have teams around such as the Baltimore Ravens, Jacksonville Jaguars, Houston Texans. Of course, I know what you're saying. If you're talking about teams like that and you put them in 1972, it wouldn't have had much bearing anyway. But all jokes aside, the NFL had 6 fewer teams, so that's less competition. Of course, yet it worked with a shorter season, and that would be one of the nuances that would be at play, one of the proverbial X factors that may have and might not have changed things. Then you look at other things. You look at what team was best at scoring. Now, immediately when you hear the best offenses in NFL history, 2 things will pop up in your mind. 2 teams that had Randy Moss as their lead at the lead. And yes, this is controversial. I said Randy Moss was at the lead for the 2007 Patriots instead of Tom Brady. But yes, you had the 2007 Patriots and the 1998 Minnesota Vikings. And of course, neither of those teams won the championship. One team had a perfect season, a perfect 16-game regular season in a 32-team league, but they didn't win the Super Bowl that year. And again, I'm just stating wins and losses. And of course, you should take into account that in the NFL, you don't play every single team in the league every single year like you do in the NBA, NHL, and MLB. And also, again, like I said, the Patriots team, they lost. I'm not sure if I did mention it already in this episode. They lost the Super Bowl that year. The Minnesota Vikings of 1998, you can make an argument that they should have been in the Super Bowl. There was a missed field goal that stopped that from happening. But who knows what would have happened if that field goal wasn't missed. There's a chance that people might say definitively that was the best team in NFL history. And, of course, I wanted to kind of tiptoe around it. You had the 1991 Washington team. Now, I wanted to tiptoe around that because this is the Washington Sports Den. I happen to be a fan of the Washington NFL franchise, now known as the Washington Commanders. And as a matter of fact, I know what you're saying. Who are the Commanders? In 1991, those weren't the Commanders, as Tom DeBomb would say. Watch the show on WBGR Sports at 3:30 every Monday afternoon. And I cannot stress it enough. You really need to check out his show. And he goes beyond just the sports and the facts. He would go into he'd go into certain things that are more so deeper. I dare to say more so philosophical. Again, it's a good watch, whether or not you're a sports fan. He'll have something for you. He'll definitely have something for you. But moving forward with what I'm talking about, without further ado, the reason I wanted to kind of tiptoe around mentioning Washington at all in this episode was the fact that, again, it's going to look kind of biased coming from the Washington Sports Den and a lifelong Washington fan. But the fact of the matter is I'm not the person who put them on this list or in this argument because, as I said in previous episodes, sources such as Sports Illustrated, USA Today, ESPN, I believe NFL Network as well, so on and so forth, have stated that the 1991 Washington team was the greatest of all time. But at the same time, again, we're going to look into stats. We're going to do a very deep and thorough analysis. And without going any further into digression, let's start with the 1972 Miami Dolphins. So as I've said, the Miami Dolphins of that year not only had a perfect season, but they also had a dominant offense that season. That year, they had 5,034 total yards. Now, I know what you're thinking. There's some quarterbacks that pass for that. That's to say that you have a single player on your offense that gets those yards by himself nowadays. Now, again, I did mention that there's certain nuances. Now, I was going to get into that. Now, I'm not just going to mention how many yards were gained or how many points were scored, points differentials, so on and so forth. I'm also going to measure them within the context of the NFL in that specific time, much like I did with the Michael Jordan and LeBron James argument. I didn't compare LeBron James and Michael Jordan head-to-head due to the fact that, again, they played in different eras, there were different rules, and there were different phenomena in the leagues at the time, in the league at the times in which they were playing. So therefore, I treated their statistics as such, and I adjusted the stats in the specific years that they played based on the averages from those years. So, starting with that, Miami had 5,306 yards of total offense in that year. So, if you subtract that from the mean, or rather the median in the NFL, which was 4,317 yards, they were 719 yards above average that season. Moving to their defense only gave up 3,297 yards, as opposed to the NFL's mean of 3,923 yards. So in terms of that, their defense, in terms of total yards allowed, was better by 626 yards. Now, onto the differential, the point differential. That's to say points for versus points against. So to calculate the point differential in the NFL, you calculate all of the points scored by one team and you subtract that by the number of points scored by their opposition. Now, again, this is just going to be like the LeBron James and Michael Jordan's episode. This episode of the Washington Sports Den is just going to be a glorified math class. So I suggest, unlike math class, I'm going to allow you to sit down, get a bowl of popcorn, probably chew some gum. Everyone knows that in my high school, you're getting kicked out of the class just for mentioning that. But in Sports Den 101, hey, whatever you enjoy, whatever helps you watch this, whatever you want to do while watching this, it's okay by me. So as I was saying, Miami's point differential in 1972 NFL season was 114 points. Now there are other factors at play. I'm going to mention their total turnovers. I'm going to mention their turnover differential, and I'm going to mention their punt return average. These are very odd stats for me to bring up, but there's a certain reason why I want to bring them up. And they're usually not brought forth on these arguments regarding sports. And that's not a good thing, because in the sport of football, football is too multifaceted for you to only look at the yardage, only look at the scoring, because there's so much at play there. Football is a game of positioning. Some would say that football is almost an allegory for wars of attrition. It's not just a sport where you just go to a goal or a net or a base. I'm not even disrespecting those sports. I love those sports. But at the same time, it is far more nuanced in those sports. So with that being said, you have to treat it as such by respecting the nuances of statistics in the sport. Now, moving forward, the 1991 Washington team had 5,741 yards. Now, if you calculate that with the NFL's median at that time, the median number of yards gained in the NFL in 1991 was 4,969. So you subtract Washington's total by the mean of the NFL, or median of the NFL that season. They were better by 762 yards. Now, if you look at the defense, the points allowed, their defense yards allowed, Washington's defense allowed 4,293 yards against the NFL's average of 5,016 yards, and that was better by 723. Now, before I go any further, I should mention that among the teams on this list, the 1972 Miami Dolphins, 1991 Washington team, 1998 Minnesota Vikings, and 2007 New England Patriots, Washington has the best differential between points allowed and yards allowed and the median yards allowed in their season. So I just wanted to point that out. I'm going to point out who had the best statistics among the other teams just now. I'm not just mentioning that because it's my team. Again, I really do not want to look biased here, but it's pretty hard to do when you're named the Washington Sports Den and you're a Washington fan wearing Washington's team colors on the plaid shirt. So without going any further into digression, as I tend to do, I'm going to say this. You also have the turnover statistics at play and the turnover differentials at play. And again, I'm going to withhold that information until later. But as for the point differential, Washington had a point differential of 261 points in 1991. Moving forward to the Minnesota Vikings, who set the NFL record at the time, who set the NFL record at the time for most points in a single season, which was later broken by the 2007 New England Patriots. But I want to stay on task here. I had a specific set of statistics for us to analyze in this episode. But I do want to mention the Minnesota Vikings, again, one of, if not the greatest NFL offense of all time, based on what various people would say. And I'm just going to leave it at that. Now, if you look at Minnesota's yard total from 1998, they had 6,264 yards opposed to the league average, which was much higher. I wouldn't say much higher. I'd just say it was higher than it was in 1991. And I definitely say it was much higher than that of 1972. So the league average for yards gained by a team in 1998 was 510 yards. And believe it or not, the league average was held by Washington that season. What are the chances? 1998, the year I was born, a Washington fan. Well, I didn't mean to say born a Washington fan, like literally. But the year I was born, we happen to have the league median in yards gained. Go figure. So anyway, Minnesota was better by 1,254 yards. And I just embarrassed my team by mentioning that Minnesota was so much better than Washington that season, but facts are to be said. And I'm being objective here. If my team is outclassed, they're just outclassed. Who cares? Facts are just facts. You just have to take them as they are. And if you look at Minnesota's defense, they allowed 5,066 yards opposed to the league average of 5,117 yards. Now, they were better than the league average by a mere 51 yards. With that being said, they were still better than the league average. They were good in terms of defensive yards allowed, but if you think about it, they were technically just one deep pass with blown coverage away from being below average. Slightly below average right there in the median. But at the same time, it's just one of those very odd statistics. Now, the reason I put emphasis on that is because among all of the teams on this list, 1991 Washington, 1972 Miami, in 2007 New England, the 98 Vikings have the worst differential between yards allowed and the median number of yards allowed in the NFL in the season in which they played. Now, the point differential for the Vikings that year, 260. And again, this is an astounding number. Take nothing away from it. And it's also very close to what Washington had in 1991. Believe it or not, it's just off by a single yard. Statistics, mathematics, it's just amazing. It's just really an amazing thing. They're just really, it's an amazing field to look at. Now moving on to the 2007 New England Patriots. 6,580 yards, which is the best out of any team on this list. They had a yards differential. Rather, they had more yards than the median NFL team at that time in the year 2007 by 1,278 yards. And believe it or not, the median was held by the New York Giants of that season, who, believe it or not, were the eventual Super Bowl champions of that year. That's right. Out of 32 teams, the New England Patriots had the most total yards. And not 4 places behind that, not 8. But if you go all the way down the list to the very medium, that's 15 spots. You had the New York Giants that ended up beating the New England Patriots to win the Super Bowl that year. And they decrowned the would-be perfect Super Bowl champions of that season. They're forever remembered for that. And people say that, generally speaking, when you look at a Super Bowl, you always remember the winner, and very seldom do you remember the team that lost. But they say there are a few instances where you'd remember that. One was that year, because the Patriots lost a would-be perfect season. And the second one was more recent, and it involved the Patriots, but rather it had the Patriots on the winning side of history as New England caught that infamous interception against the Seattle Seahawks in Super Bowl 49. Of course, Malcolm Butler, he's the player of the game just for that one play alone. He completely altered the trajectory of that game. That was Seattle's game. I'm not even a Seahawks fan, but I'm just calling the facts as they are. But that's neither here nor there. And again, going back to the statistics and the facts at hand, the New England Patriots of that year allowed 4,613 yards, opposed to the league average of, when it comes to allowance of yards, 5,197, which was better by 584. Now, in terms of the point differential, the New England Patriots had the highest point differential of all time in the year 2007. Their point differential, that's to say that their points for versus points against, rather points for minus points against, equaled 315. Best in the history of the National Football League. Now, based on the stats that I've just given you, you would postulate that the New England Patriots are the best team. Rather, 2007 New England Patriots are the best team in NFL history. After all, they have gained the most yards in the league history. They have the best point differential in league history. And again, they had a perfect season in a 16-game season where there are 32 teams in the NFL. You would figure as much. But why didn't the USA Today, Sports Illustrated, ESPN, and I believe the NFL itself, when I say the NFL, I mean specifically NFL Network and its analyst, why would they say that the 91 Washington team was better? It goes into the nuance of the statistics that I mentioned. Mind you, all of these teams were among the best in the league and the time in which they were playing in terms of yards gained, yards allowed. Well, actually, in terms of the 98 Vikings, not really with yards allowed. But what is that factor that would put Washington over these other teams? Now, I'm sure you may have heard this time and time again from football buffs, time and time again from analysts, time and time again from coaches, time and time again from people you know who just can't keep their mouths shut about football. In other words, for the last part, people like me. So, what do you hear? There are three phases to the game of football: offense, defense, and special teams. The phase that is most ignored and the phase that has a lot of bearing upon the results of an NFL game. And if you look at the special teams, which is one of the X factors that was likely considered when they did name 1991's Washington's team the best in NFL history, Washington's averaged, get this, 13.3 yards on punt returns. Now, this sounds like an insignificant statistic, but mind you, field position is very important, and this is just an average. So that's to say that they had a lot of punts in which they gained much more than 13 yards or 13.3 for that matter. They don't even do decimals in actual NFL games. So you look at that, and you look at the fact that they had the most punt returns for touchdowns in the NFL that season. And again, seems insignificant, but field position is most of the battle if you look at the sport of football. In the sport of football, your average starting field position nowadays, let's just use the current time, or rather the most recent season, because we're in an off-season period right now, 2021-2022 season. Most drives start at the 25-yard line because most kickoffs or most drives that start after a kickoff start at the 25-yard line because a lot of kickoffs go into the end zone for touchbacks. On average, or rather, most of the time, you have to go upwards of 70 or so yards to get to the end zone. And if you also take that facts into consideration, if you get better field position, that's to say if you get the ball as a result of a turnover, such as a fumble or an interception, you have to travel less space to score. You have shorter drives. So I have to ask you this question. Would you rather start the drive at your own 25 or at your opponent's 25? At your opponent's 10 when you have less space that you have to work with. So that's why it's an X factor considering punt yardage or punt returns. And going back to what I was saying about turnovers, among all the teams on this list, the 91 Washington team has the best turnover differential, as they have a turnover differential of plus 18. And the worst turnover differential, believe it or not, belongs to the one and only perfect NFL season, the team that has the one and only perfect season in NFL history, the 72 Dolphins. Their turnover differential was plus 4. And if you look at the total number of takeaways, Washington had 41 compared to Washington's 1991 team had 41 compared to Minnesota's 1998 team that had 34 and New England's 2007 team that had 31. So that's to say that they were better than New England in this field by 10 points, by 10 turnovers, and Minnesota by 7 turnovers. Now, if you look at it, turnovers are a major statistic. It's not just, it sounds like, okay, it's just 10, just 7. No. Those are 10 or 7 drives that were completely altered. 10 or 7 drives that were shortened a great deal and allowed their offenses not to have much work to do as a result of defensive skill, defensive acuity. So I'm not trying to make a point here. I'm rather just trying to make people understand why certain things are said and why certain arguments are made, and to just help shape people's opinions. I want people to have their own opinions, but at the same time, I want it to be informed by fact. I want it to be informed by logical reasoning. I want it to be informed by statistics. So with that being said, of course, again, like I've mentioned with all these teams, you had high scoring teams. You had teams that gained a large sum of yardage, and you had teams that did a fairly great job of stopping their opponents. And I'm not trying to make fun of the 98 Vikings when I say this, but they are a key exception here. Again, like I said, there were only one blown coverage. There were only one incident of blown coverage away from being below the league average of 98. So with that being said, again, the X factor that was possibly considered when USA Today, ESPN, and NFL Network made their judgments regarding the 1991 Washington team, if you look at the X factors, those were probably the special teams and turnovers. Again, the units that have bearing upon where the ball is positioned. Now, of course, if you have a shorter field to work with, that's going to reduce the number of yards you can gain in a drive, of course. So you can also say that could have impacted Washington's total yardage in 1991 because, again, if your special teams and your defense are getting the yards for you, that's going to balance things out. That's going to take away from what your offense is doing. So I should put an asterisk next to what I said about total yards. That's to say I should have said total offensive yards. So when I ever said total yards before this point, I'm going to say total offensive yards. But I really hope that most of you understood what I was saying anyway, because either way, if you were to do all purpose like that, the numbers would actually be a few thousand higher. That's actually, to be honest, Washington's all-purpose yardage was 2,000 yards higher than their offensive yardage in 1991. As is the same with the 2007 Patriots, so on and so forth. That's generally how it works because you're accounting for turnover returns like fumble returns, interception returns, kickoff returns, punt returns, so on and so forth. So that's my nugget of wisdom. That's the more you know for today. I hope this was a really entertaining math lesson, if you will. I never thought I'd be giving math lessons pretty much when I started doing a sports show, but go figure. Well, this is Felix Bassi from WBGR Network signing off. It's been fun. Can't wait for next week's episode. Take care.
Soto at first after the homer by Rendon. Kendrick into the opposite corner. That one well hit. Springer